Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of NCTA's On Track Live webcast. We appreciate everybody taking the time to join us this morning. There's a few more people still logging on, but we'll go ahead and get started here since you get to listen to me talk for a minute. Appreciate very much today.
Okay,
We've got
I will get back to you. Okay, I have your number. All right.
Like to urge everybody to put their devices on mute while we're going here. I will have the chat box open, so if anybody wants to throw out some questions as the discussion's going on, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and I'll be watching that so we can pass questions along. Or maybe later in the conversation, if anybody wants to do the little raisey handy thing or something like that, if you'd like to engage in the conversation, we certainly welcome that. As we always do, I'll start off with a little bit of a quick news update and some shameless self-promotion, and then we'll get on to our guest. I've been looking forward to having Frank Wilner with us for a long time. I'm a big fan, read all of his stuff, and it's great that Frank volunteered his time today out of his schedule to be here with us, and we very much appreciate him doing that. On the news updates, just maybe three quick things that folks should be aware of since the last time we were together last month. On the STB front, we mentioned that the chair of the STB, Marty Oberman, declined to seek another term, and he's also declined to seek a year holdover term that's available to folks who are leaving. So Marty's going to be out the door here in the next couple of months, and that's one of the things we'll be talking with Frank about, is what kind of impacts that might have on the Surface Transportation Board's agenda. On the regulatory front for the other part of our business, the things that are happening that affect coal and other big bulk commodities, over at EPA, there's a full court sprint going on right now to finish all the regulations that they can in this election year. There's this thing called the Congressional Review Act that any regulatory actions that are taken in the last 120 legislative days of a Congress can be overturned by the next Congress by a simple majority vote in both the House and the Senate. And of course, that has to then also be signed by the president. So, with the prospects of another Trump administration and the potential for Republicans keeping control of the House and maybe gaining control of the Senate, that Congressional Review Act will be a real factor next year. And the real powerful part of the Congressional Review Act is that if it gets implemented, not only does it revoke the regulation that was done in the last minutes of an administration, but it also prevents that agency from doing a similar regulation in the future. So that's a very powerful tool, and the regulatory agencies and the Biden administration right now are doing everything they can to move all the high-profile regulations that they can by this, say, April, which is when that Congressional Review Act authority could be kicking in. So that's something we're keeping our eyes on. And one other thing that's in the news today, the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing a case that looks at the Chevron deference, and this is another thing I'll ask Frank to opine on here in a little bit. But this could be a very big rule. The Chevron deference is a previous judicial standing that gives regulatory agencies a lot of flexibility in interpreting, when Congress passes a law that is not quite clear, which is all the time. The courts give deference to the experts at the agencies. It's called the Chevron deference. And there's a major case being heard at the Supreme Court today, as a matter of fact, that could overturn that and change the way things are regulated all over. So things to keep your eyes on. We'll of course, be reporting on all of this stuff in our biweekly e-newsletter, the On Track newsletter that shows up in your inboxes. Thank you. We've got several guests today who are joining us. If you'd like to get that On Track newsletter on a regular basis and stay up on the things that we're keeping track of, it's really simple. All you got to do is join NCTA or become an NCTA sponsor. So feel free to reach out to Melinda if you'd like to make either of those things happen. A little bit of shameless self-promotion before we get started. The next month's On Track Live Our guest is going to be Frank Maisano. He's with Bracewell in Washington, D.C., writes a newsletter that's followed closely by the Energy and Environment Press. And we'll be talking to him about what's going on, with this Congressional Review Act stuff and also election year politics. And then in March, our guest is going to be David Nahas, who many of you know from Railroad Financial Corporation. This will be right on the heels of his big rail equipment finance conference out in Palm Springs. It happens every year, so we'll get an update from him on all the things that get talked about at the Rail Equipment Finance Conference. And then finally, mark your calendars for May. Our big super conference is happening in Chattanooga this year. It's shaping up to be a barn burner. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary. We're going to have a dinner ride on a train. The golf event's going to be at one of the most fabulous golf courses in America that's right up on top of Lookout Mountain, historic Civil War site. See the whole valley of Chattanooga and the river down below. The O&M conference goes first from May 20th to 22nd. The spring conference follows the 21st to 23rd, and on the overlap day is when we'll golf and have some plenary session speakers for both groups. That should be very interesting. So I believe registration is open. Nod your head, Melinda. Registration's open on the website, movecoal.org, and encourage everybody to come out and meet us in Chattanooga. So that's enough listening to me, Jack. Thank you for putting up with shameless self-promotion. Our guest today is Frank Wilner. Frank is the Railway Age Capitol Hill editor. As I mentioned before, I love to read Frank's stuff. It comes with always comes with great historical insights and context. Frank's a former Surface Transportation Board Chief of Staff. Prior to that, he did a stint as Associate Vice President for Policy at the American Association of American Railroads. And one of the things that made me want to get Frank on here is Frank recently published a book. I'm going to do this and see if I can make the Zoom actually see it. It's kind of hard to do. But Frank's new book is titled Railroads and Economic Regulation, an Insider's Account. And it's a fabulous book. Goes through the whole history of rail regulation in the United States, goes through, the railroads struggling under the ICC and the Staggers Act and the formation of the STB and the transformation of the rail industry from one that was troubled and on its back to one that's today a Wall Street darling. So this book is for sale. In next week's On Track, I'll include a link with a report on our session today. I'll include a link that you can go to purchase the book. I'm about halfway through it, and it's fascinating. So watch for that link in your On Track next week, or if you don't get the On Track and you'd like a purchase link, send me an email, Wardo, W-A-R-D-O, Wardo@wardo.com, and I'd be happy to hook you up with a link for where to find that. So with that, Frank, again, thank you so much for volunteering your time to chat with us today. Your book's dedication page opens with a quote from Atlas Shrugged, and I was just curious, is that because Dagny Taggart in the book does something with railroads, or is there maybe a deeper meaning in that coming about?
There's a very deep meaning. When Ayn Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged around 1957, the railroads were a declining, almost failing industry. And as you read Atlas Shrugged, well, it's fiction, it's actually a blueprint as to how Congress moved toward partial deregulation. Just an absolutely fascinating book to me. And not to offend anyone, but next to the Bible, it's probably the most sold book of any that has ever been published. I understand that it's still selling about 250,000 copies a year, and it's extremely popular on college campuses. But its attraction to me is that it was and is a blueprint toward deregulation, economic deregulation, of railroads, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned from it. And Dagny Taggart, I hope, is a role model for my own wife and for my daughter, and that's why I had the dedication to them.
That's great. We're going to talk a lot about deregulation here in the next 45 minutes. But maybe let's start with the regulators who get most of the attention here over at the Surface Transportation Board. I mentioned that Marty Oberman, the chair, who has been very vocal through his term, is leaving and may be gone in the next couple of months. What does Marty's departure from the STB mean for what that body does next and can get done moving forward?
Well, I'm expecting Oberman to leave by May of this year. You know, when he took office, he was the oldest ICC or STB regulator ever to take office. He's pushing 80 years old right now. I believe him when he says he just wants to take time and travel, but there are other theories. Rail labor has been aligned with the socialist elements of labor, pushing Joe Biden to name Primus as chair of the STB. That may worry Marty, although I've never known him to shy away from a fight. The Chevron doctrine loss may affect him as well, because that, and I do expect the Supreme Court to overturn it. There are two justices already strongly opposed to Chevron, Gorsuch and Clarence Thomas, but that could very well stop the STB from trying to better define a very much undefined common carrier obligation. And we know that that has been a objective of Marty from the get-go. But whatever, he's going to be leaving by May. And what that means is you're going to have two Democrats and two Republicans. It's going to be very difficult for the STB to move any controversial rulemakings during that period, because a tie vote means that it has failed. For shippers, you might be better off with Primus as the acting chair, but that doesn't look like it's going to be. Fuchs was supposed to take over as vice chairperson. Well, the president chooses the chairman, permanent chairman of the STB. They rotate the the vice chair of the STB, who becomes acting chair when the chairman departs. Fuchs was supposed to have it. They decided that Karen Headland would be the vice chair for this year, and that means she will become the acting chair. She is very much less vocal, less controversial, less assertive than is Primus. That may not be good for shippers. It may be good for shippers, but I think what shippers are not recognizing is that a lot of the agenda of both, especially of Primus, Robert Primus, is to increase the employment on railroads. And look at your coal trains. How many crew starts does that have between the Powder River Basin and an electric utility? 5, 6 crew starts. The compensation of a rail employee today, wages and benefits, actually exceeds $200,000. So you're looking at adding, if you have a permanent 2-person crew, you're adding more than $1 million per run that are direct costs, compensation, fuel, wear and tear. Those are direct costs that show up in the rail cost adjustment factor. So to the extent that labor is successful through the STB in increasing employment, those are higher rates that shippers are going to have to pay. So I think that's something for shippers to bear in mind when they link arms with labor in search of certain objectives.
That's really interesting, Frank.
Now, looking forward, I don't think that President Biden is going to nominate a new STB member in this election year. I don't think that person could possibly be confirmed, given the politics, especially Republicans who are expecting Trump to have another term, and they want Trump to name the next STB member and supposedly chairperson. So I think we're going to go the rest of this year with Hedlund and Primus as the two Democrats, Karen Schultz and Patrick Fuchs as the two Republicans. I don't expect very much coming out of it other than a formalization of Ex parte 711 sub 2, which is the reciprocal switching rule, which I think has been terribly watered down from what shippers wanted. The original proposal, known as sub 1, was to allow reciprocal switching where it could increase competition. They canceled that. No explanation as to why they canceled it. And they've substituted sub 2, which would make it available only if the average of service falls below what it was during the height of the supply chain crisis. So we'll see how that goes. But if shippers were hoping for reciprocal switching, I don't think that they're going to find panacea in sub 2.
Yeah, just as a point of interest, Frank, I mean, our shippers in the coal business and the other heavy commodities that get involved with us, the reciprocal switching was never their priority. But it was interesting to watch it. And one of the rumors I heard for why sub 1, which was based on competition and economics, got thrown out and substituted with a service-based reciprocal switching standard was that Marty wanted to have unanimous decisions, and that's the best he could get through. Is there any truth to that rumor, do you think? Or
there's certainly been an attempt to have unanimity, but if reciprocal switching is what shippers wanted, this is what they're not going to get. Then again, is reciprocal switching a panacea? And there are a lot of viewpoints on that, but primarily railroads have to compete. In duopoly situations, there is every reason for railroads not to compete, because for Union Pacific to poach traffic from Burlington Northern only invites Burlington Northern to poach traffic from Union Pacific. That said, it's working in Canada. Not only is it working in Canada, but when Canadian National made a push to merge with BNSF in 2015, Canadian National offered as a voluntary condition of that merger for universal open access on its merged line. So obviously, CN and BN didn't terribly fear the competitive impact of reciprocal switching. Now, there was an academic study done during the 1980s that looked at competition out of the Powder River Basin between BN and UP, and it concluded that duopolists do compete. But then again, that study was done before 2002, when railroad rates started to increase and increase dramatically. I think the best answer to whether railroads would compete with their reciprocal switching is a quote from Joe Heinrichs, the new CEO of CSX. He was quoted in Trains Magazine not too long ago saying, railroads don't compete with each other, they partner. Whether that was a Freudian slip, I think that's going to come back to haunt him. But that was Heinrich's opinion, and my 20 years at the AAR convinced me that railroads sue each other with quite often but they mostly do partner, and they don't compete. Remembering the days when it was dog eat dog, and it becomes a race to the bottom. The real competitors of railroads have always been trucks and barges.
Are we with the CP KCS merger done now? I mean, is that the last big Class 1 merger, or is there still possibilities for something like that to go on to have even less than a duopoly?
Well, there are a lot that would like to see just two North American railroads. I just don't think that application for further mergers, which would create true transcontinental mergers, could be proposed without Congress taking action and perhaps shifting merger authority over to the antitrust division of justice. And we know that the antitrust division is vehemently opposed and has been opposed to railroad mergers, notwithstanding the fact that end-to-end mergers are really efficiency enhancing, but it just not in our future. I cannot see that. That's my opinion.
I wanted to pick up on one other thing that you mentioned before when you mentioned labor during the last service crisis that we lived through in 2022 and spilling over into 2021, 2022. We saw. I think it was unique. I don't know. You can tell me if it was unique. I think the shippers and labor got closer together during that service crisis than I think I've ever seen it happen before. I mean, is that a correct observation? And do you see that shipper labor alignment continuing?
They did, but everybody should be careful with whom it climbs into bed with. The role of labor is to increase employment, and whatever you think the economic rents are of the railroads over and above their revenue adequacy, there are three entities fighting for that economic rent. One is investors who own the railroad. The other is labor that wants to take more of that economic rent for its members, and the third is shippers that want lower rates. Do the math. The more that goes to each group, the less available to each other group.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to watch. I guess the proof's in the pudding. Let's maybe talk about some of the proposals for mostly labor-driven proposals for legislation coming out of the East Palestine incident. Where the crew staffing requirements, things like that come in. I mean, are those the kind of issues where labor and shippers are more likely to go back into their respective silos?
Our parliament of whores called Congress, which never misses an opportunity to troll for more political contributions, is always ready to propose legislation for one interest group or another. There are two pieces of legislation out there right now. One is Senate Bill 576, and that grew directly out of the East Palestine accident, but it has some interesting barbs in there. It would give the Federal Railroad Administration additional authority over train length and safety inspections, both of which are intended to increase the number of rail employees. It would increase the allowable fines by FRA, but most importantly, that legislation would impose a two-person crew requirement, again shifting the economic rents over to labor. Well, that has been put on the calendar by Majority Leader Schumer. The Minority Leader McConnell is opposed to it. I don't think that the votes are going to be found to put that legislation on the floor for a vote this session. But let's assume that it does go to the floor. Let's assume that it is passed. Well, the railroads then are going to be looking to the House to deep seat that legislation. And the railroads have always had one of the strongest lobbying efforts in Washington. They have a revolving door within the AAR. Ian Jeffries came from Senate Commerce. Adrian Anarchis, their lead lobbyist, came from Senate Commerce. Melissa Conley and Fred Miller came from Transportation Infrastructure on the House side. Jordan Stone came from Senate Appropriations. Those relationships are strong. Those relationships are very meaningful. In addition to that, you heard Marty Oberman talk about what railroads have spent on lobbying, and it's in the millions of dollars. Never count the railroads out for being able to channel or to stop legislation. There's another piece that of legislation that is probably worth thinking about. It's a service related piece of legislation put forward by the Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin. That has literally no chance on its own, but the threat there, at least to railroads, is that some of the language could be appended to S576 if that does move. But my opinion, for what it's worth, is that neither bill is going anywhere this session. Congress hates controversial bills during an election year. Nobody wants to vote on something that could lose them a vote in November.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. And the closer we get to November, the higher that bar gets. You mentioned Senator Baldwin's bill. That contains a lot of language over defining the common carrier obligation, doesn't it? I mean, what, there's been a lot of, through the most recent service crisis, there was a lot of discussion about that common carrier obligation. I'd be curious to know your view on the obligation to begin with, where it comes from, and what are the prospects for either Congress or STB doing anything to tighten that common carrier obligation?
Personally, I'd rather see the STB do it. But again, if Chevron is overturned in this Loper case that's before the Supreme Court today, at least in oral argument, I think the STB is going to be prevented from doing it. But again, Congress is just not capable of getting into the detail in legislation that would be required to, I think, define a common carrier obligation. There are a lot of interstices in legislation that regulatory agencies fill in. There is a value to them. You can imagine if regulatory agencies couldn't flesh out the broad brush that Congress provides, the courts would be absolutely strangled with cases asking the judiciary to do so. Yet the opinion of the conservative justices is the role of the courts is to say what the law is, not for independent or executive branch regulatory agencies. And that harkens back to the Marbury v. Madison case at the beginning of our republic, where the Supreme Court said, yes, the court will decide what the law is or what the law is not. So as Bill Dempsey used to say, it's a rat hole worth watching.
Most regulations end up getting litigated anyway, albeit it takes several years for it to play out. I mean, if Chevron is struck down by the court, I mean, does that just put this process on steroids, or move it to an earlier phase, or
No.
does jurisdiction shopping become a big deal? Or
the previous meaningful Chevron doctrine occurred back in 2000 when Linda Morgan imposed a 15-month moratorium on railroad mergers. And the court used Chevron to agree that the STB had the authority to do what had never been done before, to block railroad mergers. It blocked the CN-BN merger. Interestingly, Rob Krebs gave a talk after not only it was blocked, but they had to cancel the merger because the financing was falling apart. And Krebs said that he had always fought for the ICC and STB to have merger authority, and all of a sudden he wasn't sure that it shouldn't have gone to the antitrust division after what Linda Morgan and the board did to that merger. But that was the previous Chevron doctrine decision. And it's important to understand that where Congress gives the STB specific authority to decide a rate case, for example, that's not a Chevron issue. It's a rulemaking that's outside the box, where the board is trying to fill in gaps in legislation with its own interpretation of what it thinks Congress actually meant. Now you can go back to congressional history, but it's often been said that citing congressional history is like waving to friends in the audience, because when the congressional history is written, of course, each member wants to get in what they thought they were voting for in the bill.
Yeah, interesting. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I mean, do you have any opinions on what's going to happen in this next election? I mean, Congress and the White House?
Other than it being very nasty, absolutely not. I could sit here and complain about both sides. I mean, the sad part of what's happening in this country is that we have polarizing right and polarizing left, to a point where all discourse in Congress has really been taken down to the least common denominator. There is, there was bipartisan agreement, and can go back to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee when Bud Schuster and oh golly, come on, his name started with an O. This is when you're 80 years old, you tend to forget names, and it'll come to me in a moment. But the point is that the Republican and the Democrat could sit down together, and they could hash something out. And the best example of that was a highway bill right around 1998. Jim Oberstar and Bud Schuster. And someone, and I was at this press conference, and someone from the Washington Post said, how can you justify these earmarks of individual members that are spending millions of dollars, such as the Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska? And they both agreed that, look, the earmarks are about 5% of the total bill, but it's a small price to pay for bipartisan support. And they had their arms around each other, and they were able to compromise and move forward. I think that's impossible in the Congress that we have today. So I wouldn't predict how things are going to turn out, other than we're going to have 70+ million Americans unhappy as to how the election turned out.
I blame Zuckerberg for the level of our political discourse, but that's a whole nother webinar. So
social media, it's clearly it's a cesspool of misinformation, but it is guiding so many voters today. I would hope that when we look at our little corner of the world, railroads and shippers, that there is enough interest in the trade press that people are following authoritative reporting and not looking to social media for misinformation. Things like you have speakers of different opinions. I mean, that is so important today in ensuring that misinformation does not become rampant.
No, thank you for that, Frank.
I'd like to go back, Wardo, just for a moment. Are there alternatives to reciprocal switching? personally, I don't think that it's going to work. The fact that the railroads are not going to compete. My column in Railway Age in February is going to look about 5 or 6 alternatives, but there are 2 that I am really attracted to. One is a fix in the antitrust laws that also includes the STB taking action. The STB ruled about 20 years ago that a railroad only has to quote a rate from origin to destination. And so in bottleneck situations, a railroad doesn't have to quote a bottleneck rate. The STB could reverse that decision and say that a shipper can demand a segmented rate, a rate from the bottleneck to a junction point. And while the line haul through contract may be not subject to economic regulation, it is subject to the antitrust laws. So a shipper could challenge the bottleneck rate before the STB and threaten railroads that don't compete on the line haul in contract with a antitrust violation. The other is something called anarcho-capitalism. And it's got a strange name and kind of a standoffish name, but a libertarian economist named Murray Rothbard and David Friedman, who is Milton Friedman's son, whom I happen to know over a long period of time, are both advancing the idea that why do we have Congress and independent regulatory agencies telling shippers and railroads what they should do or how they should price? Why can't the private sector do this? And the notion of anarcho-capitalism is to take it away from Congress and the agencies. And let's say, for example, shippers and railroads would each name 3 members to a panel. This would be arbitration. There'd be 3 shipper members, 3 railroad members. Jointly, they would name 3 economists that they agree upon to a panel. And the 3 panels would then vote on shipper grievances. Now, the sides would be bound to accept the majority vote. If they couldn't agree, the sides would have also jointly named 3 arbitrators, and the arbitration decision would be final unless it could be shown that it was arbitrary or capricious, and then it could go to the courts. But it would be a purely private sector determination, and we would take politics out of the equation. And the shippers and the railroad reps and the economists would all be knowledgeable on railroad issues. Personally, I think it is an efficient way to go. Those concerned about the $33 trillion federal debt, well, here's another opportunity to do away with the STB. A lot of the work that the STB does could easily be shifted over to the Department of Transportation. Do the same thing with the Federal Railroad Administration and the Federal Maritime Administration. So you start satisfying all sides, but most importantly, it's a private sector determination and not one that is steeped in politics.
And Ayn Rand and Dagny Taggart would probably approve. Am I correct?
I would hope so.
That's good. I just want to remind everybody, if you've got any questions for Frank, we're way past our halfway point here. So if you've got any questions for Frank, feel free to raise your hand or type a question into the chat box here, and we'll get it asked. So feel free to toss it in now. Let's shift maybe a little bit from the regulatory side to the business side a little bit. I mean, I read a lot about the railroads now. A popular phrase is, we want to pivot to growth. Is that a real thing? You know, are we going to see real efforts toward that, or is that a talking point at this point, Frank?
Now, there was a lot of excess capacity on the railroads, and the railroads did a lot to reduce that excess capacity. There are arguments that they chased away some of their competitive traffic, the intermodal, that they have reduced capacity in order to charge more to captive shippers. I don't know that there is a definitive answer to that, but the economics are straightforward. There have been three phases in railroad history. In the beginning, there was the growth of railroads. Everybody wanted a railroad to serve them. And there were a tremendous number of new railroads that were created. One of the best examples is the Nickel Plate Railroad, the New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, built a railroad absolutely parallel to what New York Central had between New York and Chicago. And it didn't take long for the dog-eat-dog competition to begin that race to the bottom, and railroads were failing. Contrary to popular opinion, the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887 was not created to solve shipper problems. It was the railroad lobbying machine that wanted an agency to create a floor beneath which rates could not go, to save railroads from themselves. And you saw that repeated with the Motor Carrier Act of 1935. Railroads were the principal proponent of motor carrier regulation, again, to create a floor. Well, all of the years of regulation, the Interstate Commerce Commission had a mindset, and it was accurate at the time, that railroads were a monopoly. But as trucking increased its reach and its competitiveness, railroads lost their monopoly status, and yet the ICC didn't change its viewpoint. There were such things as umbrella rate making, attempts to equalize rates. And so the second phase of railroading was the destruction, really, financial destruction of much of the industry. By the late 1970s, it looked like the industry might actually have to be nationalized. Every railroad in the Northeast had failed financially. It was spreading to the west with the Chicago Rock Island Pacific and the Milwaukee Road. Ayn Rand's blueprint, Congress in 1980 partially deregulated railroads, and that was the third phase. The emphasis of that 1980 regulation, the Staggers Rail Act, but there are only about 5 people in Congress who were around when it was passed. Railroads make a terrible mistake referring to staggers. No one knows what the hell they're talking about. Partial deregulation, economic deregulation in 1980. But the ICC and its STB successor focused primarily on restoring railroads to revenue adequacy, that they would earn enough not only to maintain their plant, but to renew their plant. Well, a great thing happened in the process. The railroads became revenue adequate. Over the past 14 years, they have distributed $253 billion back to investors through stock dividends and stock buybacks. And yet the STB not only has a difficulty in saying the industry is revenue adequate, but it has ignored what the former ICC said in 1995. It said that when railroads reach revenue adequacy, the railroads will have to take the burden with particularity as to why they should be able to raise their rates in the future. And that hasn't happened. I think Marty is the first really activist regulator who has tried to make that pivot. But But the board has yet to say, look, the industry is revenue adequate. The railroads now have a burden of proving that they need additional rates. One way around that, and again, I'm getting back to my February column in Railway Age, is you could look at all of the traffic, a laddered approach, and you could say that railroads need X number of dollars to cover their direct and their fixed costs. Anything above that are economic rents. Now, how are we going to eliminate those economic rents? Well, how much of the traffic, for example, is going at a ratio of revenue over costs over 400%? Well, if we took away that 400% and moved it down to 350%, how much are the economic rents reduced? And you keep doing that in a laddered approach. Then you look at all traffic 350%. You move it down to 300% until you get to where the railroads are revenue adequate. They're earning their direct costs, they're earning their fixed costs, but they are not earning economic rents. And I can't see what the moral opposition would be that railroads earn more than revenue adequacy, given that they have monopoly positions in so many areas. Kind of getting around, and I guess ignoring your question that I have to get back to.
No,
Are they poised? Are they poised for growth? Look, every new piece of competitive traffic, intermodal, that you're able to attract, and if it pays even a penny more than direct costs, labor compensation, fuel, repair of ordinary wear and tear, every one of those pennies goes toward the fixed costs that railroads also must cover. And to the extent that competitive traffic pays anything toward those fixed costs, reduces the burden on the captive shippers who need the railroads most. So there is great incentive for railroads to go out and find additional traffic, and it's a benefit to captive shippers. Now, how you segment that traffic, if you have so much that you don't have the capacity, well, then what's wrong with a scheduled railroad? We schedule airlines today. Why shouldn't railroads say to a shipper, this train is leaving at 7 p.m. You're going to have your traffic there, or it's going to leave without you. And to have an absolute schedule. Who is opposed to scheduled railroading? Labor. Why? Because it reduces the number of employees that are required to run the railroad. I think if shippers would take another look at scheduled railroading, they might see an advantage, because railroads would reduce costs. To the extent you reduce costs, you're able to bring rates down. So kind of a convoluted answer.
No,
but I think more people have to look out of the box and not just say, well, this is bad because some other labor said it's bad, or somebody in Congress said it's bad. Look at it through your own selfish prism.
That's a great explanation, Frank. And has the term precision scheduled railroading become so stigmatized now that we need a new term or something to describe that concept? Is it really PSR?
Probably every railroad has its own
cult of operating ratio.
Every railroad has its own iteration of precision scheduled railroading. Also, it's a relatively new concept. New concepts have to be tried. They have to be perfected. We'll see how this how it moves. But again, where shippers and railroads can get together, and if they can find consensus, I think that is another means of fixing, of compromising, and making it a win-win situation.
Yeah, excellent. I'm gonna do a last call here. If anybody's got questions for Frank, it'd be a good time to put them in the chat or raise your hand or something. You know, the reason I love reading Frank's columns is you always get that historical comment and that historical context. And I'll hold up the book again. I mean, you know, being able to put these things and take a longer view is really so helpful. Frank, I'm just curious, how did you? This is an impressive piece of scholarship here, great amount of detail. How did you physically go about compiling this? Were you going through old manila folders, or is this just all in your head, or how did you physically pull this together?
Well, I saved a lot of material over 50 years, and had every time we moved, we probably paid another few $100s for the movers to move all of these cartons of material. But I love libraries, and we have good libraries in Washington, and I had good notes, and I don't have a life. So, I mean, I really enjoy railroad economics. But also you collect stories, and for those who do read the book, I've got a lot of stories in there that haven't been previously told, of interactions of good things and bad things. But I think that makes it kind of fun to read, because it creates personalities. It makes people human. It's not just a regurgitation of history. So
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating book, and I appreciate you. Yeah, appreciate you going to the effort to do that. It's great that we've captured this, you know, your level of experience and all that kind of thing. Frank, is there anything we haven't covered there that you think that you think we should take off before we part here? Or
I'd only say, and Marty will get very mad at me, but my whole life is one of people getting mad at me. I think his legacy, and it's going to be unfortunate, that he was more bark than he was bite. He had good intentions, but the problem is intentions don't guarantee a result. Now, whether because he couldn't find the votes on the board, whether he didn't want to use his majority on the board, which he could have done, whatever the reason, he's going to leave office without having achieved much of what he wanted to achieve, and much of what he said he was going to achieve. And for Shippers, and I think for Marty as well, it's sad.
Yeah, that's he was great at the bully pulpit, and he was there at a very interesting time with a prolonged service crisis that maybe eclipsed that. Maybe that's one other question I'd ask you before we part here. I think people are in general agreement that last service crisis is over at this point, but they come around from time to time, from natural disasters and all those other kind of things. Are we prepared for the next one, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, well, you're probably never prepared for the next one any more than any country is prepared for the next war. We always seem to be fighting the previous war, fighting the previous service failure. I don't know where to look in the future. Again, I don't have confidence in government. I think private sector solutions make far more sense. I don't know how to go further than that. But that said, there is one person at the board that really intrigues me. You know, this is Patrick Fuchs. He came to the board as the second youngest board member at age 29. What is he, about 32 now? If you look at the guy's resume, what he has accomplished is what most of us don't accomplish in our entire lifetimes. He is an out-of-the-box thinker. Marty called him the best lawyer on the STB, even though he's not an attorney. He could be an interesting person to watch. He's waiting to be nominated to a second term. He's in his holdover year right now. His first term expired, or I guess his first term expires in another week, or something like that. But he'll be in his holdover term. It's not clear whether he is going to be renominated. He's Republican, renominated by Biden. He's considered a very thoughtful individual, solid, seriously thoughtful, calm, definitely calm. I think it would be a shame if he is not renominated to the board. But that's something that you need to watch over the next year. Does Biden renominate him? I don't think he could be confirmed this year, but there could be a new nomination, certainly by Trump or again by Biden in 2025, where he would have a greater chance of being renominated. But he's the guy to watch, as well as who's going to fill the vacancy that is created by Marty, and what's going to happen to Fuchs. Otherwise, Hedlund, who is age 78, I don't see her looking for a second term. Her term expires early next year. Primus goes on until 2027. Schultz goes on until 2026. So the board is pretty much in place for 2024 and 2025, with the exception of who fills in for Marty and what happens with Fuchs over the next 12 months.
Awesome. Well, Frank, thank you again. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Always love, keep writing all the great stuff. I've learned a lot from you today. I learn a lot from you every time I read every time I read your columns, and I'm looking forward to finishing the book.
Keep reading, Wardo. I'll get you mad at some point, but that's all right.
That's good. It's good stuff. So thank you again, Frank. I appreciate it. Everybody, like I say, watch the next On Track for a link to Frank's book, or if you don't get the On Track, shoot me an email, wardo@wardo.com. And Frank, appreciate it very much. Delightful conversation today. Take good care.
Thank you for listening to me. I'm on
Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.